We finally have another very big and topical discussion to go over for today's critical thought. We're going to be discussing the Stop Killing Games initiative and kind of petition that's going on right now. What's good, what's bad about it, and whether or not this is going to help or hurt game preservation as a whole. At the time of recording this, the petition is currently at just over 1.2 million signatures. I'll be including a link to the site down below, and we'll be posting screenshots from their FAQ in a second. So, this petition has been gaining movement as kind of a way to fight back against the issues when it comes to games going end of life or end of service, which, if you're not familiar with that term, is predominantly used in live service games to describe when a game is basically taken offline and is no longer available anywhere. Unless you can, somehow get a pirated copy or get lucky along those lines, it's gone. And there have been many mobile and live service games that have ceased to exist once they have gone end of life. Some become available to be played, like downloaded, or in kind of like a specific version of it, like we kind of saw with Multiverses. But for the vast majority, once they are gone, that's it. So the kind of plan from the Stop Killing Games initiative is to basically make it a penalty or against the law that if a game goes end of service and has not basically been given a means or some kind of version that's available to be played without publisher interference or without needing servers, that the publisher and developer will be penalized per copy. The idea is to essentially make it a punishment so that you won't do that. So that for any game going forward, there must be, I should say, a plan for when the game goes end of life to give it, sunset and allow it to be able to be played indefinitely. And on paper, this sounds like a really great thing. And it's again why the signature or the petition for the European Union has grown so big over the last few weeks. But as someone who has interviewed many developers and has kind of become this middle ground between consumers and developers, I do have some issues with it. And this is coming from someone, again, who's a huge supporter and believer in game preservation. Again, we've said many times here that video games are art and they should be treated as such. The issues I have with this come down to the FAQ, and specifically how vague it is when it comes to this concept. In terms of how these games should be approached or be developed, there's nothing. There is no information about what should be the standard when it comes to preserving a game. And the FAQ specifically says that it's being kept intentionally vague so that people aren't going to pick apart every little single thing. But this is kind of an issue when we talk about game preservation, especially when we talk about game preservation from the consumer standpoint versus the developer standpoint. That there needs to be some kind of formal organization. When it comes to the game industry and game development as a whole, it is woefully abysmal when it comes to setting standards or kind of, fixed rules when it comes to any aspect of it, and especially true when we talk about game preservation. And a lot of the issues that kind of gave birth to this whole Stop Killing Games initiative can be traced back to how horrible the game industry has been when it comes to preserving games. Again, even like 1 to 2 generations ago, the systems or games are becoming harder and harder to play, let alone what we're talking about many years in the past. And we cannot just rely on remakes and remasters. We can't just give everything to Night Dive and let them remaster every single game ever made. And part of the problem when it comes to any kind of formalization is that the game industry is bad when it comes to trying to define, everything about it. There are people who still feel that video games are nothing more than just a child's toy and that's it. We all have our favorite family-friendly games, like Fear and Hunger, Grand Theft Auto, and of course Mario Party, the most horrible one of the three. And when it comes to setting standards, no one wants to be the person that says that every video game must have this, where every game must be about that. And again, that's a fair sentiment to have. But when we're talking about game preservation and about making sure that this is meant to be played forever and ever and ever, it's a different story. There has to be some kind of ground rules set. Now, the organization, or the Stop Killing Games Initiative, did do one thing right. They said that their plans and what they want to happen have no bearings while the game is still being actively developed and being actively sold. And that's a very big point about this. And if I can find that video, maybe that article I wrote about how I would handle game preservation, I'll include a link to it somewhere around here. So what they want to do is that the moment that a game hits end of life, content is done, support is done, blah blah blah, that instead of it just disappearing forever and ever, that the developers must have some plan to allow this game to be playable without any more publisher support, publisher interference, and make it readily available for anyone who has bought that game. And that is kind of another point that I'm going to come back to in a second. On paper, this sounds very reasonable. Again, it's why so many people have signed this petition. But as someone who has talked with many game developers who've studied game design, the game dev process, there's some very noticeable problems with this petition. And it kind of, again, gets in the way when we talk about what we want when it comes to preserving games. Being able to play games beyond their shelf life is the goal of game preservation. It's not about just buying or being able to play games for free forever and ever. It's to make sure that if a game came out 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago at this point, wow, I'm feeling old, that someone can play it no matter where they are, no matter who they are, and that it's not going to cost them 5 to 10 times the MSRP for it. And like we've said with previous discussions in terms of game preservation, we can't just keep kicking the can down the line. We can't just say, oh, just let Nintendo throw another virtual console up for their next platform. We tried that with Sony when they were when they kept doing backwards compatibility for each console, and that was great. But then what happens when they decide to cut it and there was no other formal plan around? Well, now a vast majority of PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3 games are very hard to play, again, unless you use their virtual plan. But when they get rid of that, then we're right back to where we started. GOG is a great option as well for PC games. And to me, the idea of not only preserving games, but making sure that they are playable on modern platforms is a gold standard that I want to see. But the problem is that GOG is still a business. If they go away for whatever reason, all those games go away with them. And now this is a point where someone will say, well, Josh, just download all the games before GOG closes, before they go under, if that ever happens, and you'll be fine. But it again gets at the same issue, that there needs to be an actual formal organization or formal group that handles this. Because if we don't have this, we're just repeating this issue again and again. And it's part of the problem I have with the Stop Killing Games initiative, that what they're saying only applies to games going forward. They specifically mentioned they are not talking about games that have already been released. So in a way, this is not really going into the likes of game preservation. Because if we're only talking about games in the future, it's still not solving the problem as to what's happening right now. And then the other point, as I said, is that without having any kind of idea or game plan for how this works, just saying, go do this, doesn't really help anyone. If you want to provide developers with the tools or the means or the process to allow their games to be sunsetted and have an live version, more power to you. But just sitting there demanding that every game must have this, but we're not going to tell you how to do it, how much the process is, or what's even going on with it, it's just making things even more muddied. And like we said a few minutes ago, yes, developers are not a fan of being told that you must do this in your game. And it's again why, for my thoughts when it comes to game preservation, that this stuff should be handled by a third-party organization. that when that game is finished, when there's no more content, when there is never going to be any more for it, and it will never earn any more money, hand it to this group and they're going to take care of it for you. But forcing this on top of development just feels kind of icky, in my opinion. That, again, no two game developments are the same. You can say that, okay, for major AAA companies who have to do this, that they'll have the resource and the tools. But what about indie developers? The FAQ said, but it doesn't cost all that much. But you're not giving specifics as to what this means. And in a game design standpoint, every live service game is also going to be different in this respect. Again, playing something like World of Warcraft versus playing, the original Guild Wars or Shattered Galaxy. But again, those games wouldn't count because they're before this time. It's this kind of very murky wording that makes me feel very apprehensive about this. And like I said, I'm a huge supporter when it comes to game preservation, but there has to be some kind of formal rules for how this works. There has to be an agreed upon standard if you want this to work. Just saying, do this, don't do that, or everyone must do X without any more guidance is just adding more complications onto game development. Now, the FAQ mentioned that there shouldn't be too much difference between single-player and multiplayer games, and they did somewhat comment on the issue when it comes to licensing, especially licensing music, characters, and so on. Because when we talked about preserving like virtual pinball tables with the Farsight games, the Pinball Arcade, we had a lot of discussion about the nightmares when it comes to IP and copyright ownership, and how complicated that can get, especially when you have things being split between multiple parties. It's again why there's a lot of games that people have been begging GOG to get access to that they can't because no one knows who owns all parts of it. And this again is part of that issue when it comes to any kind of game preservation. And it's also again why the Stop Killing Games, my mouth's going to be slurring a lot on that, specifically is focusing on games now and in the future, because they don't want to be throwing in that additional headache of what about games from 3 years ago, 5, 10 years ago, a game that featured popular music, not so popular music, famous voice actors or movie stars, and so on. And as I said at the beginning of this, that the initiative is good on paper, that there should be protections in place, so that if someone wants to play a game or check something out that is end of life, that it's still available in the future. But the biggest point, as I said, that I have a problem with this, is specifically talking about this from people already have copies of a game. This just feels like a band-aid fix to a greater problem. So what they're saying is if you've already bought the game, you already downloaded, you're good, yeah, you'll have access to it. But that doesn't solve the issue of games being killed. It doesn't help us when it comes to game preservation. In order for game preservation to work, if I am in 2025 or 2065 or any other year, and I want to go and play a game from 2016, 2010, I should be able to have access to that. And if I don't, then that is an issue with it. And we can, of course, argue that the Stop Killing Games initiative is not supposed to be the perfect fix for game preservation. It's only focused on a very specific avenue of it. But I feel like with this being so intentionally vague, and it's kind of leaving game developers and game development out of the equation, that it's not really going to, I think, help as much as people think. And I do feel that we need to have a greater discussion about this. That there needs to we need to come together to set a fixed set of standards for what game preservation means. Because if we're just going to keep arguing over what games should be allowed, what games shouldn't, when should this start, when shouldn't, and how it's even done, then nothing is ever going to get done. And for people who think that just this initiative is going to fix everything, it is definitely not. And there has to be more done. Now, this does lead to future resolutions and future bills being passed, then, all the more for fantastic. But there has to be more than just saying every game should just not have or every game should have an end-of-life feature. There has to be more on top of that. Now, the other argument that people bring up is that this will kill the live service industry, or this will ruin games as a service. And in that respect, I'm not as, jumping for joy for the developers on that front. Because part of this initiative and part of this problem is that every live service game should have a contingency plan for end of life. And that, again, is why this petition is so popular. Because, as I said, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of mobile and live service games released over the past 15 or so years that you cannot play anywhere. They are gone. They have been wiped clean off of the earth. They have ceased to exist. So much time, energy, work, and of course money, both from the developer and the consumer standpoint, just poof, disappear in a puff of smoke. And that is a huge problem. But we cannot just say that this is going to solve everything and that there has to be more done. To wrap things up for our discussion here, there's no easy answer to this. Now, as I'm recording this at the beginning of July, the petition will end, or the kind of petition deadline ends on the end of July, and then it will be sent to the European Union for review and discussion. What this means going forward, nobody knows. But this is one point that I think is going to become very interesting for the comments. What do you think about this as a whole? We have a lot of developers, students, and enthusiasts who watch this channel, or any newcomers who are coming right now. And I feel like we're going to get a very broad mix of opinions depending upon what your background is. Like we said, from a consumer standpoint, this sounds very fair and fine. But without providing any guidance or means, it just feels like you're throwing work or more work on top of developers. And without having anything that can be like a guide or a checklist or something tangible and set that can be done, it just kind of leaves us feeling more like a half measure than trying to develop an actual system for game preservation. So this is, I guess, going to be a to be looked at again in the future ending. We don't know what's going to happen after the petition finishes up and where things will lead going from there. And as I said, I think that this is not going to be helping as much as people want. And we still need a lot more work and effort done to really deliver on the fact that video games are in fact art. Thanks for watching, and a special thank you to our Patreon supporters. If you enjoyed the video, do the YouTubing stuff, be sure to visit our Discord and Patreon, and you're interested in more in my thoughts on design, check out my game design books.